Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasāmi. Blessings, good evening. We have some technical difficulties tonight, so I can't see the screen. So I'm speaking blind, as it were. I hope there's someone out there listening, otherwise I'm just talking to the wall. Earlier on I was mentioning during the meditation about the practice of Buddhanusati, recollection of the Buddha, which is one of those constant themes students of the Buddha have to come back to, return to, for obvious reasons. We are students of the Buddha, and we should, from time to time, even if it's not your main meditation object, familiarize ourselves with the qualities of the Buddha, maybe the life story of the Buddha, and just ask yourself what the Buddha symbolizes to you, whether it is the historical person or the qualities, the wisdom, the compassion, the purity of mind that the Buddha symbolizes. These are important to remember because they give us direction in practice. And the practice is you might call it a way, a pathway towards what we want. It's the highest happiness of Nibbana, liberation, freedom from suffering. So to stay on that way, or that pathway, recollecting the Buddha is one part of that. A very common question that Buddhists often ask monks is they say, well, how important is the last thought we have before we die? Because many Buddhists believe and accept the teaching on karma and rebirth. When you die, consciousness goes, as it were, to a new life, or consciousness ceases in this life and arises in the next life. So then the state of mind at the time of death is important. And many Buddhists believe the last thought you have can have a massive influence on what happens next after the body dies. Well, of course, the last moment of life tends to be conditioned, affected by the previous moment to that, and the previous moment to that. As one of the central features of the Buddhist teachings is about the explanation that the mind and body are conditioned things, impermanent things that arise, pass away, and are constantly subject to change. The mind isn't just a constant one object, one thought thing. We have many different mind states, thoughts, moods through our life. And each preceding moment will have an effect on the next moment. So, if we learn to train and cultivate the right qualities and live in a good way through our life, that's the best preparation for that last moment of our life. Nevertheless, the Buddha did point out that if you're panicking, say you were in a situation where death came on unexpectedly, you weren't in a hospital bed for many months and waiting to die perhaps, but maybe just suddenly in a situation where you realize you're dying. He said if you're panicking, you don't know what to do, think of the Buddha. The recollection of the Buddha as an object of mind is considered that powerful, that important, that at any time, and not just when you're dying, but when you're alive as well, it can drive out all the other forms of stress, unwholesome, unskillful thinking, intentions from the mind. Can bring you a sense of peace, calm, joy. Always a very skillful or wholesome thought to bring up. And particularly if you are in a moment when you're panicking or nervous or unsettled in any way. Could be unsettled by just some very ordinary thing that happens in your day. You have an altercation with another person, or you have some physical pain that suddenly comes up, or something happens. Thinking of the Buddha is always one good strategy in those situations, just to bring attention to the present moment. When I say thinking of the Buddha, I mean recollecting the Buddha as an object of mind. So just now we were recollecting either the word Buddho or a visual image of the Buddha. Some people expand it and recite the different qualities, the 9 main qualities of the Buddha in the Pali or in the English, the Pali reflection in Iti Piso, Bhagawa, Arahang, Sama, Sambuddho, and so on. Some people will recite that over and over again to establish mindfulness, keep their mind focused on the Buddha in the present moment. So there's different ways you can do it to bring up mindfulness and recollect the Buddha. But the aim is to develop the power of mindfulness in particular, but also to gladden the mind. You're recollecting the Buddha, I think for most people who call themselves Buddhists or want to follow the Buddhist path, they find it's gladdening. However bad our own life is, or our own state of mind, however agitated it is, unhappy it may be, just recollecting the Buddha can bring a lot of calm and peace. You might even say comfort. It can uplift the mind. If your mind is feeling particularly down, or you're in a dark place, or feeling depressed, sad, when you recollect the Buddha, it can help you, give you a new perspective on your own state of mind at that time. You might say, just knowing that there was an enlightened teacher, and one of the qualities of the Buddha, you say, is Samma Sambuddha, self-enlightened, self-taught, which is an amazing thing in itself. Just knowing that there was an enlightened, fully awakened Buddha in the world is such a happy thought for many people, that it kind of pulls you out of some of your own stress or agitation, disappointment, and so on. So it's a very powerful, wholesome thought that we can turn to at any time. As I said, when you're facing the fear of death, or just fear in general, fear of something at work or in life, when you're facing some difficulty, you can recollect the Buddha. And it helps you to get through that difficulty, perhaps, at least steadies your mind. So monks know this when they're out in the forest, maybe, or in a charnel ground, graveyard, charnel ground, if there's somebody who's afraid of ghosts, and then they go and stay somewhere where there are dead bodies buried, or a place where cremations happen regularly, the fear can come up very strongly. But reciting the word Buddho can quell that. And I think most monks will have had some experience where maybe they've recollected the Buddha in one way or another and it's calmed them down. Or facing wild animals, snakes, or other kinds of wild animals, or even wild people. When you have to walk through or meet with or you're in a situation where you encounter people who you find aggressive, threatening, arouse your suspicion, or you're worried, or just being people who are strangers and you're not sure what they're up to or how they will treat you, it can help to steady your mind in that situation. And that can be very useful, because when you're in situations when you feel threatened by an animal or a person, then often your own fear makes the situation worse, doesn't it? When you're afraid, you can't control your emotions so much, so then you may say something that is not the best at that moment, something that provokes the person or the animal, maybe something that expresses your fear or agitation, and so on. So recollecting the Buddha can have a very powerful effect to calm you down, steady you in that situation. Or at a time where you're under stress and you need to focus and get things done, recollecting the Buddha can bring you both strength of mind, steadiness of mind, patience to go through something difficult, keep you going. Maybe you have to do a job of work and you're tired, or it's very challenging in some way, and you recollect the Buddha and it just keeps you going when part of your mind wants to give up or just freak out or panic. There's many different situations where recollecting the Buddha can help us, and very quickly too. Quick fix to suffering maybe, because it is such a powerful thought. It's very difficult to think something negatively towards the Buddha. I think people who even have very little knowledge of the Buddhist religion and teachings and wouldn't call themselves Buddhists, even people non-Buddhists often find the word Buddha or the idea of Buddha helpful, positive, uplifting. Hence the large numbers of Buddha statues sold in garden centres and hardware stores throughout Australia, because when I was a kid, you put a little gnome, a garden gnome, which is like a little spirit with a green or red pointy cap and a white beard. You'd put one of them in your garden and feel good. Nowadays you put a Buddha statue in your garden and you feel good about that, even if you're not Buddhist. And probably if you were Buddhist you wouldn't do that anyway, but people do. That's the way of the world. It makes people feel good, feel peaceful quite quickly. It has a very therapeutic effect. That's the visual image of the Buddha, excuse me, but also thinking about who the Buddha was, how the Buddha lived. So reading the life of the Buddha, the stories about some of the stories of the Buddha can also be helpful in this way. And then having your own method to recollect, bring up to mind the Buddha. Whether it's a one word or a whole phrase or a recitation or a visual image. And you can see in the world, the way the world is, or you might say the Buddhist world, there's images of the Buddha of all kinds. Not only all kinds of materials, clay or bronze or wood or on paper, different art forms and so on. The actual shape of the Buddha, the features of the Buddha vary from artist to artist, culture to culture. There are usually some things in common, because in the text we have the 32 marks of a great man which were applied to the Buddha, that traditionally artists will try and incorporate in their work of art, their statue or their painting. Different features of the Buddha, his eyes, his shape of his body, the nature of his skin, his hair, and so on. But even then, from culture to culture and even person to person, the artist will have their own influence because they're working from their own mind, what they see a Buddha to be, and what the Buddha symbolizes to them. But generally, Buddha statues and pictures are peaceful. They impart a sense of peace. Even if you don't like the artwork, you can get the sense of peace, happiness, serenity. Because that's one of the qualities of a Buddha. The Buddha was happy, simple as that. The Buddha didn't experience stress. So when you recollect the Buddha, even as a word or as a picture or an image, if it's working, that is what it's bringing you towards, the mind that is peaceful, happy. And it may help you to remind you and think about, well, what is happiness in the Buddhist sense and according to the Buddhist teachings? So happiness, the happiness of a Buddha means the mind of a Buddha is free from the causes of unhappiness. No more greed, no more anger, no more worry, anxiety, fear, no more delusion. So a mind that's free from greed, anger, delusion and all their offshoots, to me would be a mind that is bright, happy, lucid, still, unagitated, undisturbed, and so on. You can some of the other qualities of that state of mind, or that mind, not just a state of mind. The Buddha is beyond identifying with single mental states, but the mind of a Buddha would have all those kind of qualities and more. Another aspect is the Buddha is, we say, a teacher of humans who are ready to be trained, but also teacher of gods and humans in all their forms, whoever, wherever. And the compassion of a Buddha is immeasurable, limitless, boundless, because the Buddha's mind is unattached. We say, reach the unconditioned. It's a mind that is also creative in the way it teaches in seeing people's suffering, understanding how people are suffering, but also creative and effective in giving them ways to see their own suffering or see the way out of their suffering, what they need to do perhaps. But without distinction, so that the kindness, the compassion of the Buddha is limitless, boundless. So they say it reaches to all the corners of the universe, even beyond the bounds of the normal world that we perceive and talk about. So they have sayings like they say, just as a little bird cannot possibly fill up the whole sky, because it's just a little bird flying through the sky. If you try to use words to describe the nature of the Buddha's mind, the peace, the wisdom, the compassion, all these qualities, words just can't describe the mind of a Buddha. And sometimes people would actually come to the Buddha and want him to describe what a Buddha's mind is like, or they'd sit down and try and ponder it and consider it, and the Buddha would tell them not to. He'd say, you'll never do it, you can't think it, and words won't describe it. And quite possibly you'll do yourself some damage trying to do it. You'll waste a lot of time and energy, and maybe even you'll just make yourself very confused trying to work it all out. That's one of the modern problems, isn't it? We try to work everything out. If I or someone else says, recite and do a meditation and recite Buddha, Buddha, Buddha over and over and again, or visualize an image of the Buddha and just do that over and over again. We can do it for a little while, but then the mind starts looking around for something else, something more. Either completely forgetting the Buddha and going to distraction or just some other object or mood. Or even if you're kind of sticking with the Buddha, you want more, so you want to think about the qualities of the Buddha, what you can do to become like a Buddha maybe, or to become awakened like a Buddha. And we can start trying to reason it and think it through. And the Buddha said you can't do it like that. You can't work out, describe, and use words to describe the state of the awakened mind, nibbana, or the unconditioned. You can't use words to describe the qualities of a Buddha, because the Buddha is all-knowing. And we are not all-knowing, so we don't know enough words and concepts to describe it. So he would encourage people not to even try, not to do that. Perhaps a more practical approach, encourage them to look more directly at their own body and mind in the present moment, and particularly to see where suffering was coming from and what they can do about it, how they could practice with it. We're coming up to the beginning of the Vasa, the 3 months range retreat, and we have the full moon day we call Asalaha Puja, so where we recollect the Buddha's first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which he gave to his first 5 disciples at the beginning of the first range retreat he spent as a teacher with students, with monks living with him. And we call that the first sermon or first teaching that we have records of, but actually, one occasion he gave a short teaching before that, before he'd even reached the deer park where he gave this teaching near Saranath in India. Because he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, which is a long way, several hundred kilometers away from Saranath. And when he decided he was going to teach, when he realized his students were there and may realize the Dhamma if he taught them, he started walking from the Bodhi tree towards where his 5 students, where he'd left them, where they were practicing. And as he was walking, he met one kind of religious seeker, pilgrim, walking along the road, who came to him, and he saw he was somebody with an interest in religious practice, probably a meditator, and so he said, "I am a Buddha." And the man didn't really understand what he meant, didn't get it, and walked away disappointed. At first he thought maybe he was somebody special, because he realized this person, the Buddha, had a very pleasing countenance, kind of radiant, peaceful in the way he looked. But when the Buddha said, "I'm a Buddha," he didn't get it, so he walked away. So his first teaching, just describing himself as the Buddha, didn't really come to much fruition at that time anyway. Maybe later on it did, I don't know. We don't have anything that explains that, I don't think. But at the time it didn't seem to impress the man. He walked off. And even his own disciples, the 5 ascetics who had previously been practicing with for a number of years, when he first entered the deer park and was walking towards them, they saw him. Their very first reaction was, "Oh, this is our former teacher, but we no longer listen to him, we no longer follow him because he's lost his way, he's followed the way of indulgence," because after his period of asceticism, self-deprivation, fasting and very tough practice, he started eating again, sleeping, eating again more than before, and so his disciples left him, thinking he was now indulgent and there's no way he could be an enlightened Buddha. This is a reflection maybe of the religious practice at the time. To be a teacher, certainly an enlightened teacher, people thought you had to be extremely disciplined and maybe even engage in certain practices of self-deprivation, you might say even self-harm, like fasting and going without sleep and standing on one leg and holding one's breath, all those kind of things. He'd given that up, or at least he'd modified that practice, so they had turned away from him. So when they saw him coming back, even though he was enlightened now, at first they didn't get it. And they say, oh, don't receive him. He's no longer one of us. He's no longer practicing the true path. So they planned to ignore him. But when he came in, he was so radiant and peaceful, they couldn't help but notice. And that's the case with meditators. Meditators, you become more sensitive as you meditate. You're sensitive to your own state of mind, more aware of what is a peaceful mind, what is a more disturbed, agitated state of mind. And then perhaps you become more sensitive to other people as well. You meet someone very peaceful, often you feel it and sense it, not just from their words. They may not even say any words, but you already feel something if somebody is truly peaceful. Meditators tend to pick up on that because as you train your mind, you're a little bit more sensitive, more aware to these things on that psychological level as well as the physical appearance and the material world. You're more in tune with the psychological world. So these 5 students quickly worked out that the Buddha was now different than before. And then his words seemed to back that up as he talked about himself as somebody who was gone beyond, no longer caught up in samsara, no longer subject to birth and death, and described a little bit what enlightenment meant, or the awakened state meant. And he said, well, have I ever said that before, that I'm an awakened, enlightened Buddha? And he said, no. So they started to listen to him. So, recollecting the Buddha can bring up so many useful, wholesome, skillful states of mind for us. It's a good practice to do on a regular basis, if only briefly. Like many people will begin their meditation by bowing to the Buddha or recollecting the Buddha, even if their meditation sessions they're doing other things. They're cultivating anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, or practicing vipassana. They may begin and end with some recollection of the Buddha. And also at other times when you maybe don't have time to sit down and meditate or walk meditation for long periods, like you might do on a retreat or staying in a monastery, often just recollecting the Buddha already brings the mind back to something wholesome. And it can cut through a lot of the daily distractions and worries and agitation and stresses. As I said, it's a recommendation if you don't know what else to do with your mind at times when you're really afraid or stressed or at the end of your life. I mean, you never quite know whether you have reached the end of your life. Sometimes, fortunately, people think they're about to die, but they don't die. So, nevertheless, it's still worthwhile turning to think of the Buddha if you don't know what else to do with your mind. Bring up that image of the Buddha, the word, the visualization. And they say in the history of Buddhism, that some people have actually become enlightened, or at least gained one stage of enlightenment on their deathbed by recollecting the Buddha, because it is such a powerful thought. There's one monk I knew of who was a well-practiced forest monk. He, like many monks, he always had the thought maybe to go one day to India. But this is like 50 years ago, a long time ago. This monk was practicing. He's passed away now, but he had this kind of thought in the back of his mind to go to India on pilgrimage to pay respects at the Bodhi tree where the Buddha was enlightened. And he had never acted on this thought. He just thought, it'd be nice to go to the Bodhi tree one day. But nothing ever came about. And then out of the blue one day, his good karma meant that a lay student, disciple of his, offered him the travel costs and offered to facilitate him travelling to India, which in those days meant, if I remember rightly, getting on a boat to across the Bay of Bengal from maybe from Burma, either southern Thailand or Burma, across to maybe Calcutta, then travelling by foot, by bus, by train. In those days you couldn't fly, or it wasn't easy to fly. So this person agreed to facilitate all that, to pay any costs of any of ticket, travel price, and also travel with him and arrange for everything so it could happen. And this monk had never, as far as I know, had travelled outside of Thailand, so it was a complete unknown to him. So to have someone make this offer made him very happy. And he thought, this may mean I can fulfill my wish to go to the Bodhi tree where the Buddha was enlightened and worship and meditate there. And as soon as he had that thought, and as soon as this person had made the offer, and he considered that this person was somebody who was well off enough that they could really genuinely afford to support him to get to India, he said this beautiful image of the Buddha arose in his mind spontaneously. He didn't create it or try to do anything special. He said as soon as he realized he would be able to go to India, the thought of the Buddha, the visual image of the Buddha, came up in his mind. And he said even when he opened his eyes, like he had a moment of, we say, rapture and sukha, piti and sukha arose. His mind became calm, peaceful, and this image arose in his mind, in his mind's eye. Even when he opened his eyes, that same image was still there, and he could see it with his eyes open, as if it was just hovering in front of him. And it didn't disappear, and he said it didn't disappear from that day on until he actually travelled to India, which took a while, because in those days it was a long journey. Got to the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, meditated there, visited the other holy sites where the Buddha was enlightened, where the Buddha passed away, where the Buddha gave his teachings and so on. And then travelled all the way back to Thailand. The entire time this image of the Buddha was with him. So as a form of recollection, as a form of samadhi, you might call it a samadhi nimitta. And when you recollect the Buddha, that's where you're aiming for as a meditation practice, is to develop some form of nimitta or object that you can keep in mind, hold in mind. And that way you can overcome the 5 hindrances. And that's, any meditation, whether it's mindfulness of breathing, cultivation of metta, recollection of the body, and so on. The aim in the beginning is always to help you abandon the 5 hindrances. So he said it did it very well for him, and it was almost spontaneous. So his explanation was, well, he's been a student of the Buddha in a previous life, and this was his good karma that he's previously developed, coming back to him, supporting his practice at that time. It brought him a lot of joy, and as we say, it uplifted his mind. So his meditation went very well once he started recollecting the Buddha in that way. He said normally he would recollect the Buddha by reciting Buddho, 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 as his meditation object, whether sitting or walking. But in that case, he had this visual image which he now focused his mind on. They say when you recollect the Buddha, like many meditation objects that we call anusatis or recollections, where you keep them in mind by remembering, literally remembering or not forgetting the object, it can bring you to a state of samadhi we call upajjhara samadhi, excess samadhi, where the mind isn't completely absorbed like in appana samadhi or jhana. It's pre-jhana, but it's very close to jhana. And in Upacara Samadhi, you can still experience certain objects of mind. A thought can arise, you can hold a thought in mind, you may hear a sound, can sense things in your body and so on. But the mind is peaceful, it's not disturbed by the different objects that come into consciousness. It can experience them but without being distracted or disturbed or caught up in them. So Upacara Samadhi is a level of Samadhi very suitable for contemplation and reflection. So Buddhanussati can bring you to that point, but they say it can't bring you all the way to Appana or Samadhi or Jhana, one pointedness, or single pointedness of mind. So one would carry on, maybe having developed Buddhanussati, then one would take up Anapanasati, for example. From having developed Buddhanussati, the mind is peaceful, calm, serene. And then to deepen the experience of Samadhi, to make the Samadhi even firmer, more profound, more stronger. And then one takes up another object such as Anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. In terms of developing wisdom, then Buddhanussati can still be used to develop wisdom. Of course, whatever objects and experience you develop in your meditation, you can always apply the reflection on impermanence. So you see a beautiful image of the Buddha arise, it's still impermanent, isn't it? It will come, it will go, it will change. The rapture, the joy, the different characteristics of Samadhi, the uplifting nature of Samadhi comes and goes, it arises, it ceases. These are still what we call sankharas, conditions of mind. And that's the reflection when we're practicing cultivating wisdom or vipassana. They're impermanent. Joy as a feeling in the body comes and goes. Joy in the mind, mental states accompanied by joy, happiness, come and go, arise, pass away. That's what we also have to investigate. And one of the biggest sufferings of the meditator is the disappointment when that blissful, tranquil state of mind drops away or fades out. And we can become very irritated or annoyed by that, even blame other people or blame the conditions around us. And you see this all the time with meditators. People say, oh, I can't meditate there. That monastery or that retreat center or that place is no good. And there may be some truth to that, but also it may also be that they're not yet reflecting on the impermanent nature of Samadhi. Samadhi is not a goal or an end in itself in the practice, it's a means to an end, it's a support for developing panya, insight. And even the characteristics of Samadhi, states of calm and peace, we can investigate. They arise, they cease, they're not permanent, and they're not self. So if you grasp at your blissful, tranquil state of mind as a self, it can also lead to suffering. As most of us know, if you've ever had some peace in your meditation, and then that peace fades out, part of the mind just wants to get it back again. It's clinging to it, remembering it, longing for it. I wish I could have that again. I wish I was always peaceful. Many meditators have a whole period of time that they go through a sort of anguish where they've lost their samadhi. They've previously been very peaceful maybe, and then they can't sustain it for one reason or another. Sometimes it's a more physical thing. You get ill, run down, or you're very busy and you get tired, and you can't enter the samadhi or experience the same level of samadhi as you've had previously perhaps. Sometimes it's a more mental thing. You have extreme defilements come up in your life. You fall in love. That's probably a big obstacle to samadhi. It's very difficult to one point your mind if you fall in love with someone or you become lustful for someone, obsessed with someone in that way. you forget the Buddha very quickly. And similarly, if you become full of hatred or anguish, again, you forget the Buddha, and your samadhi will disappear very quickly if you're full of anger. And delusion as well. You can become very caught up in wrong views sometimes, which are very unwholesome, but you don't realize. And you start going in the wrong direction in your life. Maybe you turn against, one thing that is a big obstacle for meditators, you turn against somebody who's actually a very wholesome, good person, or someone who's helped you, and for some reason or other you turn against them in your mind. The obvious one would be like a meditation teacher that's helped you, or a parent, mother or father, or some close friend, or somebody who's helped you significantly, maybe over a long period of time, but you turn against one of these people. It can be a huge block on your practice and on your life in general. Because you've turned against somebody who maybe has done a lot for you and maybe is a good person and done many good things. When you turn against them, maybe you get a grudge, a bias against them in one form or another. It's such a powerful obstructive karma that it can stop you entering samadhi or settling down in your meditation. It can even make your mind very agitated easily, so that that comes out in your relationships with people. You easily become agitated, lose your temper, or you become suspicious of people that you don't really need to be suspicious of, perhaps. You maybe can't concentrate when you're doing a job of work or doing something because your mind is easily agitated. Very powerful kind of negative karma. So this is why the Buddha encouraged us to always try to be patient and respect those who have helped us, even if we don't like them. You don't like their personality or you don't agree with them. It doesn't mean to say you can't disagree with someone, but be aware of when the mind turns to a more negative kind of hatred or anguish towards somebody who's helped you, because that will come up in your meditation. It will block your mind from settling down. It will feed a lot of negativity that will become an obstacle perhaps in your meditation. So as we develop samadhi, we also have to contemplate the impermanence of the factors of samadhi, contemplate the lack of self in samadhi. If true samadhi gives you this sense of emptiness in a wholesome way, not emptiness as in a way of feeling depressed or giving up on the world, but emptiness of self. So if you're practicing correctly, it brings you to this emptiness or spaciousness of mind, where you're not attaching even to the samadhi, the state of samadhi, the bliss, the peace, the happiness of the samadhi. You're not attaching to that. Then there's no basis for suffering. The Buddha compared it to like the monastery or a retreat center or a monastery or a Buddhist center somewhere. Say, normally our mind is full of thoughts and crowded with lots of desires, attachments, and that's part of our experience of stress. And that's like the monastery when it's full of people. The Buddhist center is full of people. Can be even a Buddhist center or monastery can seem confusing or difficult to maintain mindfulness when it's full of people, too busy. Then everyone goes home and the monastery becomes empty, peaceful, calm. It's like the mind of samadhi. You've emptied it of all the worries and agitation. So it's a very useful state to experience. But it's impermanent, isn't it? The monastery fills up again, your mind fills up again. We also have to develop insight into the characteristic of impermanence, and that will take us to an even deeper, more profound place of emptiness, where you see even the agitated thoughts of the mind, the memories, the different mental states, the physical feelings and sensations, all of this are free of self There's no self in any of them. But that's something we have to contemplate and keep contemplating, and we use the Samadhi to help. So tonight I've given a few pointers or teachings on Buddhanusati, recollection of the Buddha, and how it can support your mind even at the most stressful or fearful times, and even in the more mundane moments and the more normal parts of our life, is a recollection to bring up frequently. If you're following the Buddhist path, then I would recommend it as one of those regular practices you do. Recollect the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, because it helps give you direction and remind you of the teacher. And it's a very powerful, uplifting thought to bring into your mind at any time. So I'll leave the talk there, and if there are any questions, we can have them after this.